Hello everyone and welcome back. We have another Rocky recap coming up and it is for Saturday, May 7th, 2022. This show's a little bit different than Rocky shows usually are because he actually goes straight to calls and talks about how he's not corporate controlled, so he can switch up the order a little bit and tells folks to call in if they can. He talks about how in just 1 week, look what happens in the world, in our town, in our neighborhood. Presumably he's talking about the huge changes that are happening associated with Roe versus Wade and the political fallout of what seems to be one of, if not the only, leak from the Supreme Court in this manner in our history. Fascinating time, especially given that this is going to be a enormous center of political organizing for the coming election cycle. This has been a goal of a large part of the right for quite some time, and to now be on just the cusp of achieving it and to have the big reveal taken away from you, it's all very interesting. And to see how it will play out is going to be for a political nerd and someone who doesn't have a uterus, quite fascinating. Anyway, he shares a story of going to a craft show and saying that the people at the show were there waiting for Rocky, and talks about how he's so blessed and the blessings don't translate into dollar bills, but when your heart is filled with the joy and gratitude and blessings of the Almighty, it doesn't have to translate into dollar bills for him to be wealthy. And the IRS can't touch it, and that makes it even better. And again, I'm very happy for Rocky that he feels this way. Too many people out there are very depressed and lonely and alone, and even if I have my disagreements with Rocky, I am glad that he is a happy person. I think we all should be. He also talks about how going to events like this makes it seem to him that people are very committed to their neighbors. And again, being committed to your neighbors is a great thing. I am a huge fan of the concept of community. And he also talks about how he gets older, and rather than his obstacles reducing, he has more on his plate. He has more obstacles to surmount, and he has the attitude of bring it on. Whatever coffee that man's drinking, get me some, because boy, I sure feel like I'm dragging most of the time, and I'm less than a third his age. Anyway, he talks about how he's sorrowful about the diesel and gas prices, and you know what? Same. And talks about how we will vote them out legally and lawfully. And it might take a few cycles to do it, but in his words, we will fix this. And I guess that perspective is easier to hold when you don't believe we are facing an existential threat caused in large part by the same people and systems that you stand up for. So perhaps we differ on the severity of the situation, and we certainly differ in the direction we should go and the tactics which we get there. A guy named Peter calls in, and we could hear Peter, but Rocky couldn't hear Peter, so they ended the call and thought they'd try again and asked Peter to call back. Rocky brings up the leak of the draft decision and talks about the rule of law being in decay. He talks about how the leaker should be severely punished, and he then talks about the misdeeds of the FBI and other government agencies, which we generally only know about because of lawbreakers. So, worth considering. Most people telling us about all of these terrible agencies' crimes committed a crime in doing so, some of which can't even live in this country anymore, many of which went to jail for it. So, again, oversimplified ways of looking at things are generally a problem if you're going to have serious analysis. Tom from Southold calls in, and Rocky can't hear him either, but yet again, we hear him just fine. And so he says there's something wrong with my headphones. You hear him fiddling in the background, and he says that they're not plugged in, which, sometimes that happens. Oh well. Anyway, no matter what we do, according to this caller, the left will do, quote, civil unrest. And I think that's probably because the government is dominated by the right, and civil unrest is one of the few remaining tactics that the left can deploy. After all, Martin Luther King said a riot is the language of the unheard. Rocky says the left are revolutionaries and want to bring us down. And, he's not totally wrong there. But as always, there's more to the conversation. And he does talk about how the left, in his words, talk about January 6th. Rocky said nobody was even armed, which is, of course, obviously not true. There is an abundance of evidence that many of the folks on January 6th were armed. Was it everyone? Of course not. It rarely is, and that's just the way protests always are. But as we always say, narrative over facts on the Rocky Radio Show. And of course, Rocky will tell you not to nitpick, even though, again, he's basing his point off of a falsehood. So that does undercut his point. He brings up how the Nazis lied and lied until people believed it. This being a reference to the Joseph Goebbels quote, something to the effect of, if you lie enough times or make the lie big enough, it ceases to become a lie. Yeah, and of course this is interesting coming from a guy who has so many falsehoods in his political ideology that he's bought hook, line, and sinker, that he has a whole worldview that doesn't have a real foundation in facts. So again, a little strange. He talks about how the Great Replacement is in the Marxist playbook and says it was written over 100 years ago to overwhelm the system. And I'm not sure whether or not demographic change is a classic Marxist tactic, but if Rocky is saying it is, chances are it probably isn't. Not quite sure what he means by overwhelming the system, but if he means it in a general way, that is how all social movements, left, right, and center, aim to work. So that's not really unique to any leftist ideology or Marxism specifically. He sarcastically says that the George Floyd rebellion of 2020 was a peaceful movement, and, of course, it wasn't. And he talks about Captain Dornan being shot. I'm not sure specifically who he's referring to here because the only results I get from Googling Captain Dornan shot redirect to spurned cop turned cop hunter Chris Dorner. But what can I say? It's one of the most popularized killings of a security guard during the rebellion was done by a Boogaloo boy who admitted it and wrote the word boog in the victim's blood. Now, this is usually the killing that conservatives refer to when they talk about the violence against police and affiliated people during the rebellion. But again, given that the name didn't yield any results, I'm not really sure what he's getting at, so I'm just speculating here. So full disclosure, if that's who he's referring to, that was not someone killed by BLM or Antifa. He brings up January 6 defendants and says they didn't get away with it like the left does. And that's probably because they were unmasked and live streaming their crimes and were more easily prosecuted by the government because of this. This isn't hard. You exist in the most heavily and redundantly recorded crime in U.S. history, most likely, without any sort of attempts to cover your identity. You have unsecured chat logs going for months talking about what you're going to do, and the government goes after you because it's easy to do that, which again underscores the point that the left is used to government repression and has taken many steps refined over generations to still operate in a hostile environment. The right is not used to that sort of persecution, and so when they get it, they are confused and think that it's brand new just for them. Anyway, he talks again about Captain Dornan being evidence that the left gets away with their crimes. Again, I'm not sure who he's referring to here, but maybe it'll come a little more clear in time. He talks about BLM being a Marxist-trained organization and being against the nuclear family. and says how they hate elderly people, elderly grandparents that have been married for all these years, says that, that's something that they hate and that we love. Of course, any discussion of BLM requires the acknowledgement that it has three primary branches: the official organization, the broader movement, and of course the slogan itself that they all rally around. Were folks in the org corrupt? Maybe. Does it matter? Well, not really to me, but I don't personally care much about leaders. I'm much more interested in movements and their diverse character. I think that's more interesting to explore. And I haven't read their critique on the nuclear family specifically, but if it's anything like what I've heard from left folks, I do find it, at the very least, an interesting theoretical concept to explore, because the idea of the modern nuclear family has sort of a basis in decommunalizing people and creating this type of structure that's much more easily divided and conquered by the forces of capital. So if that is their critique, then I'd be curious to hear more. But again, haven't looked into it too much personally. I'm always very honest when I haven't. And so I can't really give a full comment as to that particular facet of what Rocky's bringing up here. He brings it up plenty, though, so perhaps I will look more into it and try to give you some sort of a nuanced and researched take on the issue. Anyway, he goes on to say, regular folks can change. A fisherman on the Sea of Galilee was chosen to start a church that's thriving today. This, of course, being the story of just some guy on the Sea of Galilee being noticed by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and going on to start the church, the descendant of which, so they say, is the Catholic Church. And he talks about it thriving today, and I don't know if I'd call the Catholic Church thriving, especially when you compare it to its previous incarnations of power. But more than a few biblical scholars also see the Catholic Church as a very badly fallen organization and not representative of God or Jesus. But that's a whole different conversation, and it's outside the purview of this podcast. And from there, Rocky goes to a break and comes back, and Sue from Norwich calls in and talks about us being in spiritual warfare. And it's not the people that are bad in this case, but the people are being used. And he thanks Rocky for running for office. And it seems like she's implying that her adversaries are demonically possessed. And if that's what she's implying, that can lead down some very dark territory. Dehumanizing your opposition is super dangerous, and I really try my best not to do that. Rocky says that we have to confront them in every field, and then Sue thanks him for playing I Am a Christian Soldier, which maybe I missed that part of last episode. So at this point, Peter calls back, and he says the country isn't divided. Says he's listened to all of these shows and can count on his hand the number of people that are from the left that call in. And maybe I'm one of these people. And he says that they have to pay them in order to call in. But even then, the number of people that call in is minuscule. I really wish I was paid to call in. I'd certainly call in a lot more if I were paid to do so. Because right now I have to sort of walk the delicate line of wanting to engage in the discourse and being a constant nuisance, which I can very, very easily be. So I want to try to avoid being that nuisance in order to consistently engage in that conversation. So anyway, apparently we're all paid. He then says that 99% of the people on January 6th were from the right, and the left put in 100 or so people to start a fire. I'm very curious who these 100 people are and where his factual justification is for making this assertion. And he also wonders why the left didn't confront January 6th, which again is his way of getting to his point that the country isn't divided and that the left is actually the overwhelming minority. And he says, well, I guess I should address the left specifically in the moving toward January 6th. A lot of people were thinking it made most sense to not be on the streets for January 6th. Even in Trump's words, saying it was going to be wild. There was a lot of debate about this. But with huge segments of the left still facing charges from the 2020 rebellion, that cycle of mobilization had largely faded. So a lot of people didn't want to go on the streets for J6 because of their safety and because of charges they were actually facing. And he says the left is a fad, like tattoos and smoking pot. Don't worry about it. I find this kind of weird because tattoos and smoking pot predate the left and the right, and also there wouldn't be a left without a right, and vice versa. So, again, weird statements coming from this guy, not really sure where his factual basis is for these things. And he says every time they try talk radio on the left, it dies. Well, one of my favorite podcasts, Behind the Bastards, has over 11,000 ratings and averages at 4.5 stars. And that's just on Apple Podcasts alone. One has to assume the number of subscribers is many, many times that amount, because the amount of people that go out of their way to make a rating is usually a minority of the people that actually follow the show. Full disclosure, I've never put a rating on Behind the Bastards, and I've been binging it for literally years. Anyway, it's also far from the only left podcast out there. Left radio and left conventional media rarely work in a capitalist society because it's hard to get funding for anti-capitalist media in a capitalist society. This shouldn't be hard to grasp. It's not for lack of an audience, it's systemic bias, which is why the alternative media sphere is full of successful left content, and for now has been an area where the left can start to get a voice. How long that lasts, however, no one knows. Sam from Westerly calls in, and this is the person who, the day before, I called out for his repeated advocacy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, saying that that was an anti-Semitic text. You know the whole story. Forgery by the Imperial Russians. They used it to go after the Jewish population. The Nazis taught it. We've been over this. And if this doesn't sound familiar to you, don't worry about it. It's going to come up, I'm sure, in the future. And if you want to look at our past catalog, you can certainly find it. Anyway, Sam from Westerly calls in and says, you get called a racist if you ever question the narrative. And then he says that there's a new label that they put on you if you question things. And that label is anti-Semite. This, of course, is pretty interesting, given that the next thing Rocky says is, yeah, Ben Shapiro and Prager get called anti-Semites too. I'm not sure who calls them that. I don't think I've ever seen either of them called an anti-Semite, literally ever. Though I have seen them both called fascists, which is a totally different thing, and both of them could conceivably be called that, but that's a more muddy definition and not strictly relevant to this discussion. Sam from Westerly counters and says, yeah, it's just like Rockefeller and Lindbergh. Well, we'll start off with Charles Lindbergh. We all know him as the guy that flew the Spirit of St. Louis over the Atlantic in 1927. And some of us know about the mysterious kidnapping of his child. Very few of us, however, know about his fading from public life and what caused it. He was a very open isolationist at the time of the rise of Nazi Germany, but, so were many others. World War I had just happened, and not a lot of people had an appetite for another European war. Interestingly, though, he did go to Germany and see their military capabilities and was presented with the Service Cross of the German Eagle for his services to aviation by none other than Hermann Göring. But perhaps that's not as bad as it looks. It seems Henry Ford also received this medal as well. Henry Ford, the Model T, the assembly line, the authorship of the International Jew... Wait, what? What? That's interesting. Let's quote from an article in the Detroit Jewish News. Henry Ford wasn't just an incredibly successful entrepreneur and industrialist. He was also a virulent racist and anti-Semite. He not only believed and spewed hateful rhetoric about blacks and the Jews, he bought a newspaper and over the course of several years promoted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, blaming Jews for a myriad of evils that they ostensibly perpetrated around the globe. And as historian Hasia Diner explains, Ford was able to promote his hatred not only in Dearborn, but throughout every Ford dealership in the country. And due to his status and popularity, his anti-Semitism carried great influence across American culture. Moreover, Ford's venom had chilling, deadly, real-world consequences. Ford served as a role model for no less than Adolf Hitler, who mentioned Ford favorably in his Mein Kampf, kept a life-size portrait of Ford in his office in Munich, and considered Ford an inspiration. In 1938, as the Nazis were preparing to unleash their armies in Europe, which ultimately killed tens of millions of souls, the Nazi regime awarded Henry Ford with the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor it could bestow on a non-German. Testifying at the Nuremberg trials after World War II, convicted Hitler Youth leader Baldur von Schirach, who in his role as military governor of Vienna deported 65,000 Jews to camps in Poland, stated, "The decisive anti-Semitic book that I was reading and influenced my comrades was the book by Henry Ford, The International Jew. I read it and became anti-Semitic. The book made a great influence on myself and my friends because we saw Henry Ford as the representative of success and also the representative of the progressive social policy." Anyway, back to Charles Lindbergh. On September 11, 1941, Lindbergh delivered a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, which he identified the groups that he believed were conspiring to force the U.S. into war against Germany. The three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. This speech was criticized in newspapers across the country because politicians across the political spectrum denounced it. Even Wendell Willkie, the GOP presidential candidate in 1940, called it the most un-American talk made in my time by any person of national reputation. President Roosevelt remained silent, but the White House press secretary released a statement noting a striking similarity between what Lindbergh said and the outpourings of Berlin in the past few days. Many people denounced Lindbergh as an anti-Semite, and the controversy surrounding his speech irreparably damaged the isolationist cause. Quoting now from the National World War II Museum website, after the collapse of the German-American Bund, that wasn't the end of the American pro-Nazi movement in the United States. The America First Committee, whose spokesman was Charles Lindbergh, was founded in 1940 to support American isolation and Nazi appeasement. Lindbergh crossed the country holding rallies blaming Roosevelt and American Jews for pushing the country closer to war. The America First Committee was dissolved once the United States entered World War II. He also brought up Rockefeller. Now that's a family that is not just one person, but if it's an allegation of anti-Semitism, maybe Google can at least suggest which one he means. So this is from the Sun Gazette on the legacy of the Rockefeller Foundation. According to the David Rockefeller website, John D. Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Fund in 1913 as a family foundation seeking to advance social change. Maybe it's a little bit relevant to our previous speaker there talking about social change. Anyway, part of this social change was an elaborate, well-funded series of programs in the United States and in Europe to progress the study of eugenics. The Rockefeller Fund supported eugenics even after it was discovered that Nazi eugenic programs were designed to shun and denigrate Europe's Jewish population. In the years leading up to World War II, extensive financing was pumped into the German eugenics programs by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad fortune. According to the History News Network, Rockefeller Foundation specifically helped fund the program that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. By 1926, the Rockefeller Foundation had donated some $410,000, almost $4 million in 21st century money, to hundreds of German researchers, the network said. In May 1926, Rockefeller awarded $250,000 to the German Psychiatric Institute of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Among the leading psychiatrists at the German Psychiatric Institute was Ernst Rudin, who became director and eventually an architect of Hitler's systematic medical repression. Rockefeller was involved directly in committing treason against the United States during World War II. Rockefeller's involvement with Standard Oil, later called Exxon, and appointment of William Parrish as chairman during World War II directly benefited the Axis powers. Standard Oil was responsible for withholding patents from the U.S. Navy which had been supplied to the Nazis. Worst yet, the Justice Department revealed that Standard Oil had been supplying the Luftwaffe and German Navy gasoline and tetraethyl lead. We touched on American oligarchs helping Nazis, and specifically the tetraethyl lead, which the Nazi Air Force, the Luftwaffe, could not have flown without in our episode about capitalism. So yeah, I'm not really sure what Sam is trying to say here or why he brought up some pretty questionable figures to defend his comments, but okay. And Rocky goes off to a break and hangs up with Sam. And Rob Simmons is the caller coming up now. I have Rob Simmons, of course, to thank for my introduction to the audio field. It was a call to the Lee Elsey Show in response to Rob Simmons' call about Rojava that got me my first radio debut. So I always have a soft spot for the Colonel, even though I disagree with him on a great number of things. And as a former CIA agent, I have a very, very hard time trusting him. Regardless, he brings up Grinnell as an openly gay member of Trump's staff, saying that he states, "If I'm gay, do I hate myself?" He's using a classic defense here where the presence of one person invalidates any critiques that the entire administration or the movement around it cannot be guilty of some sort of prejudice. So that's obviously not a valid line of reasoning, and it only makes sense if you don't think about it. He then brings up the KKK being started by Southern Democrats and says we really need to get back into history. Sure, but let's remember the Southern strategy under Nixon and others when the Republicans embraced what were once Dixiecrat positions. So, yes, look at your history books. For reference, there's an interview with political consultant Lee Atwater while he was working with the Reagan administration. And as a fair warning, the next minute or so contains several uses of the N-word. So if you don't need to hear that today, this is your heads up.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. All right, I won't hear. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying, we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want, is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than Never Knew, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
So, yeah, that's not great. And that process of abstraction didn't stop either. And it lays bare the emptiness of the right-wing talking point that the Democrats founded the KKK. If you're going back nearly 200 years, but there are folks alive today that participated in the Republican Party courting Southern racists, yeah, learn history and actually do something about it. Simmons talked about how January 6th was involved with meddling of the Democrats ahead of time. He's a big proponent of the idea that Nancy Pelosi and others sort of let it happen. And regardless of that, the right's most committed militants went down there of their own accord. So if we are being honest here, we can't talk about liberal incompetence and possibly meddling without addressing the hard right planning to do this for months and showing up ready to throw down. Vincent from Long Island calls in and congratulates Rocky for running and hoping he wins. Apparently he paid $4.55 for gas and talks about how hard it is. And yeah, we've been over this. It sucks. I drive a V8 pickup truck, and maybe if Americans weren't so obsessed with following laws, we could have a fuel protest like the Yellow Vests did and get those gas prices down. But, oh well, a man can dream. He talks about another craft fair that's coming up and his experiences at local flea markets again. Not really much to see here. Says he's leaving at 9:30 and going to Replay. Jim from Lisbon calls in. Apparently he tried to call in earlier. And he says that it's not a fad, the left. Communists, according to him, have infiltrated and taken over the FBI, which of course is weird because the FBI has been among the most dangerous enemies of the left to this day, but okay. He talks about abortion and the whole my body, my choice argument, and it's not valid according to him because the baby isn't a part of the mother. And, you know, there's the point of viability to consider here. Is an embryo separate from the mother? Is there a time before birth that they are certainly separate? Most folks look at this through the lens of viability as a way of trying to navigate this kind of muddy question. But that line moves with the advancement of technology and can vary wildly depending on one's access to said technology. So that's interesting to ponder. He clarifies that he bases his assertion off of DNA since it's a different DNA signature in the embryo fetus than the mother, which is an interesting point. I don't usually hear that sort of thing brought up by folks on the right. But do we consider all the microorganisms in our body not part of our body? All the parts of your body that symbiotically form networks of your body, are they your body? Are they not? Is there absence from your body that impacts its viability? Shouldn't it be part of your body? I'm not here to make a value judgment on the abortion debate here. I'm trying to explore and clarify terms and find some mechanism through which we can navigate this issue. Some guy calls in from Lyme, Connecticut. I missed his name, saying you can't persuade murderers by finger pointing. I think he's saying we either need to convert folks with love, or possibly he's saying violence. I'm not going to put words in his mouth. He says that the Republicans can't win without God's people, and that the governor needs to give God's people hope at the ballot box, which seems like eroding separation of church and state and edging toward theocracy, but okay. Rocky brings up the old right-wing talking point that Hillary said that the kids are the property of the state. This seems to be a reference to Hillary's book, It Takes a Village, which, full disclosure, I have not read. But the concept of community, at least in part, as raising a child isn't inherently evil. In fact, it's how most societies have raised children for most of our history. And the more atomized means of raising kids now, especially where both parents increasingly need to work to keep the family from starving, makes the whole process much harder and probably causes a lot more stress than otherwise would be the case. But, to Hillary specifically, I'm not super interested in what an American oligarch has to say about child rearing. Rocky asks, who is the state, if children are the property of the state here? Well, Rocky's answer is the state is Hillary, the crazy uncle from New Hampshire, and AOC. That's the state. So, leaving aside that Bernie Sanders lives in Vermont, these are three people, two of which represent the overwhelming minority of the American political establishment, and somehow they are the state. Who are the rest of the government that actually do dominate our national trajectory? I mean, come on. This is silly. David from the Shoreline says that the pen is mightier than the sword, and that the pirates have put down their swords and taken up the pen. And he says that Rocky should get in there and swashbuckle them. Whatever that means. He's allowed to be enthusiastic, and there isn't much to get into. Rocky is running for office, and we'll see where that goes. Okay. Rocky says people from all over the world want to come here, and we will fix this, which seems to be his general platform and philosophy. And it's at this point that Rocky signs off and goes to replay. So, this episode, not a huge outlier for Rocky. Certainly had a couple of things that were worth getting into. I think especially expanding upon the seemingly now new rising dispute between me and Sam from Westerly is worth exploring here. Because the more he talks, the more questions arise about his beliefs. I tried to be pretty clear on Friday when I called into Lee's show that this document is an anti-Semitic document, and the world is full of shady activity. But if you're going to start talking about shady activity in the world, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is not what you use as evidence. Unless, of course, you're trying to prove a conspiracy of bigoted leaders around the world going after minority populations, in which case, yeah, I suppose you could argue that in and of itself as a conspiracy. Sort of ironically, this being popular among the conspiracy world is interesting because it is quite literally a false flag. It's something put out by an imperial government that wanted to go after their minority population within their country to great effect. That's real spooky. And again, the fact that he brought up some folks that are not really paragons of tolerance is strange. I didn't call Sam from Westerly an anti-Semite. I spoke to what the documents were. I like to allow people to make the label associated with them more clear by how they speak, rather than me giving them a label. With that said, after today, I am concerned and curious of what more is part of Sam's perspective. I'm sure we'll hear more as time goes on, and I don't intend to allow this issue to go unaddressed, because I have way too many friends whose relatives didn't survive the 1940s to not speak up against this sort of bigotry, or any sort of bigotry, wherever I see it. So, I think that's enough for today. I really appreciate your listenership, and if you want to reach out to me, you can message the Facebook page Aftonomia, AFTONOMIA, or you can send an email specifically to rockyrecap@protonmail.com. I really hope what you've heard today allows you to get an ever clearer idea of exactly what sort of person and information source Rocky is, and you can make your own decisions from there as to whether or not you want to see him as a credible source of information. I'm going to leave that up to you. I'm just here to share what I see and provide a little more information to the conversation. And I thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of it. Have yourself a great day.
I eat meat and drive trucks and shoot guns and don't trust in the federal government to solve our problems. You might think I'm joking, but I'm not a Republican. Call me when your president pulls out of Afghanistan, 'cause that's the day I'll get a cell phone number and you can call and leave a message on voicemail that day.